Good morning, everyone. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Arab Center in Washington, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this special briefing on the Iran situation, beyond Iran, protests, domestic, regional, and international implications. And I apologize for starting a few minutes late. Traffic apparently was reported pretty bad. I know mine was. And we just gave those who are still on their way a few more minutes to get in. And we hope to get a few more coming in over the next few minutes. Basically, over the past 2 weeks, the demonstration, the protests that started in Iran, different Iranian cities, are almost over, but frankly, I think they have raised more questions than we have been able to answer, whether you think of academia or the think tank community or governments or what have you. Questions have been raised in a variety. I mean, we can group them in different clusters, whether in terms of the domestic situation in Iran as to what prompted these protesters to get out in the streets of Iran, or what were the kind of internal circumstances. Were they economic? Were they political? Were they pertaining to the restrictions on individual citizens in Iran to function and to express themselves freely? Or were they the regional and international involvement, political involvement? When you look at some of the questions raised in the demonstrations, I mean, when you see signs and statements made by the demonstrators saying, and I'm quoting, "No Gaza, no Lebanon, our lives for Iran," or "Leave Syria alone, think about us," or signs saying "Death to Hezbollah," it makes you wonder as to what motivated these protesters and these demonstrations. And we do not promise to answer every question in existence today, but we hope that the great panel that we have assembled for you today would probe at least a little bit deeper some of these questions that have been asked over the past 14 days since the protests started. Our speakers are listed on the flyer that was distributed to you in terms of their bios, but let me introduce them by the order in which they are seated, from my left to further left down the head table. And they will be speaking from their seats there. Our first speaker would be Alex Vatanka, who specializes in Middle Eastern regional security affairs with a particular focus on Iran. And Alex is a senior fellow at our sister organization, Middle East Institute, and we appreciate his willingness. It's a busy week, by the way. Some of you, I don't know if you've noticed, this is, I think, probably the 7th event this week on Iran in Washington that I've been invited to. So it's a pretty busy period. So we appreciate all of our speakers being here today. Our next speaker would be Charles Dunne, who is an non-resident Middle East analyst at the Arab Center, Washington. He's also affiliated with the Middle East Institute. He's a retired diplomat who spent many years in the region, particularly focused on the Middle East in general, the Arab world, and specifically on issues pertaining also to freedoms and human rights in the region. Last but not least, in the order of speaking, our friend Kenneth Katzman, and again, thanks, Ken, for joining us today, is a senior analyst at the Congressional Research Service that keeps members of Congress in line with regards to their information, or tries, on the Middle East. That's basically, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the institution part of Congress that furnishes information at the behest or by request from members of Congress with regards to policy in the region. So we have basically established a general kind of division of labor among the speakers with regards to the clusters that I kind of referred to in my initial remark, in the sense of we're going to be talking a little bit about the internal dimension of this phenomenon and inside Iran, what prompted these protests and what the reaction is most likely to be, to continue to be, if you will, and what are the implications for the future. Will these protests recur in the future, or did we see the end of those as we've witnessed today? They seem to kind of have tapered down. Is this permanent or is this temporary? And then Charles will talk about the regional dimension, and particularly, as you will know, with the tensions in the region, particularly with the strategic definition of Iran as the #1 enemy for quite a few countries in the Gulf, particularly the coalition led by Saudi Arabia. Is this process or is this ordeal going to change Iranian policy? Are we going to see less, maybe, Iranian intervention by the demand of the street, if you will, to force the government to focus on internal issues and the internal dimension of Iranian needs? Or are we going to continue to see more of the same? And then, of course, we will also discuss, all speakers will be referring a little bit to the U.S. dimension, if you will, the challenge as the international challenges involved in this, and what are the most likely reactions expected from the United States and other. With that said, again, thank you for being here. Welcome to this event. And we will have a question and answer session as soon as all three speakers make their presentations. And there are cards on your seats to basically write your question or your comment. Once you have one, just raise your hand. Staff will pick those up and bring them up here to the podium. We will be delighted to read your question. Please identify yourself and your affiliation as you fill out the card. And we hope that we will still are committed to end the event on time as announced for you who are heading back to your offices. So with that said, Alex, the floor is yours, please. If you could turn the first microphone and we will proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Khalil, for your generous remarks. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I just said to Khalil, I said, look, I'm sorry, but I probably have more questions myself than I have answers about a lot of these things that are happening. So forgive me if I don't come with a lot of clarity. It's early days still to find out what's really happening. And what I will do to begin with is sort of touch on some of the things that create those questions. What really happened? So I decided briefly to divide my remarks into three segments, really. What happened? What, to Khalil's point, what lessons might the Islamic Republic authorities draw from what has happened? And then finally, before I pass the ball over to Charles, I'll say a few words about what the Trump administration could do, certainly from the position of an Iranian opposition. So let me start off by talking about what happened on December 28th of 2017 in this holy Iranian city of Mashhad, not far from the Afghan border. What happened was you had a group of people, a small group of people relatively, that were in the streets chanting against the government. And this is important. I'm sure everybody's by now realized that the demonstrations began as protests against Rouhani. Marg Rouhani. You didn't hear the word Khamenei. Within 2 days, Mashhad is kind of done for. It's quiet. And within the next week or so, this fire that began in Mashhad has spread to about 80 towns and cities, including Tehran itself. To me, sitting 8,000 miles away and not being able to go to Iran, all I can do is trying to piece this together as an analyst. And to me, we really don't know what happened. I will not sit here almost middle of January and say this was A, B, or C that did it. But let's go through the list. One, this was a spontaneous, angry people in Mashhad coming out. Plausible. Two, the faction around the rival to Rouhani, who lost in the elections in May of this year. If you remember him, Ibrahim Raisi, who lost in the elections. The faction around him with his father-in-law, Ayatollah Hoda, were behind it as a way of revenge and as a way of creating leverage over Rouhani. At this moment, I am more inclined to go with Rouhani's rivals within the regime having instigated the initial protests. Because the fact that it came to such an abrupt end as soon as they realized things are getting out of control tells me there's a bit of a command and control center in place, certainly in Mashhad. Okay? So they realized, okay, this got out of hand. Death to Rouhani suddenly became death to the regime. Or, Hezbollah, get out of Iran. That type of a message, which was not even the hardliners would want to see. Let me say something about Ahmadinejad before I move on. Ahmadinejad, who, as most of you who follow Iranian affairs, has become really the main opposition figurehead in Iran today, right? Forget the reformists. Forget Mohammad Khatami and all the rest of them. They don't really matter in terms of shaking the system up. Mohammad Khatami, who was a hero for so long, actually came out and said these protests are illegitimate. You should work your way through the system within the system, which is not what the youth demographic industries wanted to hear. So I think Ahmadinejad has made himself clearly, or wants to be, the sort of opposition pole to Khamenei. One of his close right-hand allies, Hamid Baghai, was recently, just a few weeks before these protests erupted, sentenced to 63 years for embezzlement. Again, a historic development in many ways, when you think about the fact the guy was a vice president only a few years ago. So there is a real bad blood situation inside the Iranian regime involving Ahmadinejad, his faction, and the Khamenei, the office of the supreme leader, and more importantly, the generals in the Revolutionary Guards. The individual who came closest to mentioning Ahmadinejad by name is the head of the Revolutionary Guards, a guy by the name of Muhammad Ali Jafari. He was the only one who hinted that this is Ahmadinejad's doing. As I said, I tend to believe more that this was done by the hardliners around Raisi and al-Huda, not Ahmadinejad. I think what the Revolutionary Guards are trying to do is to create leverage for themselves, because at some point when the dust settles, they like to go after Ahmadinejad. So basically, I think they're creating a file for him. They want to make him into maybe Amir Hossein al-Musavi or something along those lines, put him on the house arrest. But this is a moment where they can create something out of nothing and say, yes, you're behind it, which is very typical tactic by the Revolutionary Guards. All that said, if any of these scenarios are true, that this was not spontaneous, just imagine the level of tension within the Islamic Republic. I mean, that's the headline, that there is such a bad blood, deep cracks within the Islamic Republic, that they're willing to take such risks to actually orchestrate protests in the streets of the second largest city in Iran called Mashhad, which then gets out of hand. That, I think, is one of the key lessons that we have learned so far from the last couple of weeks. Obviously, in the coverage in this country about what's happened, a lot of attention has been put on the economic situation, which I think is very legitimate. I have also written about the fact that we shouldn't forget the political false promises or pledges that Rouhani has made twice now, in 2013 and again in 2017. Let's not forget he has made specific political pledges about more political freedoms in Iran, hasn't delivered. That's part of the anger, no doubt about it. But I agree that the economic situation is what really brought it to the fore, because the political anger has been there since '79, arguably. But the economic conditions are changing rapidly and not working well for a lot of the people in the society. And I think that's not going to go away. If you look at the latest reports by IMF and World Bank, what they're asking the Iranian government to do is exactly the kind of painful structural reforms that Rouhani is sort of getting on with. I mean, let's not forget, some of the things that led to the initial protests were the doubling of the price of petrol, increase in price of eggs. I mean, just imagine if the regime had to go out there and do some much more serious restructuring of the economy, which most economists, and I'm not one, but I read most economists agree that's what the regime has to do. It needs to really restructure the economy in great ways. Again, another thing that stands out for me, and if I was in the business of being in opposition to the regime, I would really focus on this. I'm not, but if I was, I would. You have a group of people today that were in the streets of Iran that have never been politically active before. By Iranian official figures, if we go by that, 90% of those arrested were the age of 25. Okay? So many of these guys who are arrested now, this year, 2017, early 2018, were basically not even teenagers. Last time Iran had a big popular uprising in 2009. So you have a whole generation of Iranians coming through the ranks whose political references now are not about Mir Hossein and Mousavi and green opposition, much more radical than that. They're about toppling the regime. Are they sophisticated in their political understanding? Probably not. What stands out is the anger, the sheer anger. And that in itself ought to worry the Islamic Republic. On the point of the Islamic Republic, what would Rouhani do? Well, look, which Rouhani are we talking about? The Rouhani, the political candidate, or the Rouhani, the guy who just got himself elected again? Because there's a huge difference. When he runs for office, he wants to promise all sorts of things, but in reality, he doesn't deliver. The reality is he keeps going back and want to appease Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And if you want to appease the Supreme Leader, you will not get big reforms done. That's just as simple as anything anyone can come up with in terms of conclusions. So this is a moment for Rouhani. This is, some people might argue this is a golden moment for Rouhani to stand up and be his own man. Now, there are a lot of people who don't even believe in this notion of a duality within the Islamic Republic, that you really don't have much of a difference between reformists and hardliners. A lot of people in this town argue that case. I tend to also believe that we shouldn't exaggerate how different they are, the reformists, the hardliners. But there are differences. There are real differences between the two camps. The question is, how do you exploit it from outside? And more importantly, how do you exploit it if you are someone who is President Rouhani in office for another 3 years? Hassan Rouhani, since he was re-elected, made a major turn away from the reformist base that got him elected, the 24 million people who voted for him, and turned to the Revolutionary Guards, seeking accommodation with the Revolutionary Guards. Which means what? Which means, okay, Mr. Qasem al-Soleimani and your brothers in arms, in uniform, we'll give you a free hand in Syria or in Iraq. That's part of the compromise, which we have seen go on for a long time now. That is not sustainable. Khalid alluded to some of the slogans. My life for Iran, not Gaza, not Lebanon. This is not new. They used to focus on Lebanese Hezbollah, now also Gaza and Syria, and which brings some real serious policy questions to fore. What is Iranian foreign policy all about? Because if you look at what's going on inside the country, it's the economics that makes people get up in the morning and think what's going to happen next. It's not what's happening in Syria. For whatever it's worth, it's not what's happening in the Arab world. And I think this is the first time the Islamic Republic in its history, almost 40 years, has to reckon with the fact that its people are not interested in its ideological pursuits in the region. They don't want to see money they don't have spent in the region. I think that's one of the key lessons that came out. Will Rouhani be able to change much of what Iran does in the region? I doubt it, unless he decides to really pick up a fight and go and head on with Khamenei. That's not been his style. Rouhani has never been the guy who confronts. He's much more the guy who likes to co-opt. If you want a guy in the Iranian system right now who confronts, you need to look at Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but he'll be picked up probably any day soon and put in prison, if not under house arrest. So on the point of reform right now, I think really what we can, at the very best situation, hope for is Rouhani can sit down, as he did back in 2013 when he took a thick file over to the office of the Supreme Leader and said, Mr. Khamenei, let me show you some of the statistics here about how the economy is doing. If you don't make a deal on this nuclear issue, the whole economy is going to collapse. We're on the brink. Now, Khamenei already knew that, because before Rouhani even knew, he had already initiated the talks with the Americans in Oman. This was not news to Khamenei, but it became a reason, a way for Khamenei to save face. So he didn't have to take the blame. He said this new president is the driver behind it. So whatever happens with the nuclear deal, he can say, well, not my doing. It's this guy called Rouhani who's doing it. So, in other words, Rouhani has to have a tough conversation with Khamenei, and we just have to hope he can convince Khamenei, if you are someone who believes that the only way forward in Iran is gradual change, then that conversation needs to happen. Because as we've seen in the streets of Iran, there is this anger that will come out again and again and again. You know, government officials in Iran are pointing to 700 to 1 million new jobs needed to be created every year. They're making about 1/3 of that. What's happening with these other kids that are coming out of the university system? And this is one of the problems of the Islamic Republic, by the way. Produce too many graduates, and they need jobs. And I don't see anything in terms of a miracle happening to the Iranian economy. So in terms of the economy, the oil price will probably stay around the $60 a barrel in the foreseeable future. That means the Iranian budget's not going to go anywhere north anytime soon. It means they have to do with what they have. And I think unless, as I said, unless a miracle happens on the economic front, how do you let steam out? You can only do that by pursuing meaningful political reform. Again, I don't want to sound naive. The supreme leader of the land, who's been there almost 30 years, he's not just going to nilly-willy agree to reform. So how do you force him? That becomes the challenge for the likes of Rouhani, who, by the way, has already started clearly thinking about himself being the next supreme leader when Khamenei, who will turn 79 this year, passes on. So this is a moment where they can do a real deep soul-searching in the Islamic Republic and agree among themselves that the ones who brought the Shah down in 1979, that generation is either dead or dying. And the young ones who are in the streets, they don't care about the Shah. They don't care about Yasser Arafat. They don't care about any of these ideological pet projects of the regime. And the regime needs to make a big U-turn and start focusing on home. Let me say a few words, since I got just a couple of minutes left, on how to U.S. options vis-a-vis the Iranian opposition. Look, I might be wrong on this, but for whatever it's worth, I don't think the Trump administration, a year into office, has a coherent Iran strategy. Every time I hear this administration talk about Iran, I am much more likely to hear grievances, which includes the speech on the 13th of October. And grievances are fine. People shouldn't forget why the U.S. is upset with Iran. But that's not a substitute for strategy. And if you think a blanket travel ban on all Iranians is a strategy, well, you can forget about getting too close to the Iranian opposition, because everybody in Iran was upset with that. In other words, this is also an opportunity for the Trump administration to come out and make a clear-cut distinction between the Islamic Republic as a political entity that is an adversarial force in the Middle East and threatens U.S. interests. That's on one hand. And the Iranian people, which in my view are the biggest instrument in the hands of any American administration that seeks to bring about regime or at least behavioral change. They are the ones you want to tap into. This administration has to think hard about how do you do that? How do you help them? I mean, I know there are articles being written about arms being shipped into Iran. I think that would be a total disaster. You definitely don't want to start shipping arms to the ethnic Baluch or the Kurds or whoever. That will just fall right into the regime's playbook and will be a disaster. Instead, you want to focus on simple, powerful messages that will have a broad audience. And this is the final point I make, Khalil. The son of the Shah, the last Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, you can argue whether you like the guy or not. I'm not a monarchist either for or that. But one thing he is doing very well, both in the Iranian Farsi language media and in English language media, he's simplified the message to the idea of the need for a referendum on whether you want the Islamic Republic. You know, I think that's very powerful. You might never have that referendum. But the idea of a referendum focuses the mind on what are these people in power since 1979 doing in my name? What are they doing that's good for me? I think that's the kind of thing that's needed right now. Plus the issue of getting the Europeans to come along with this Trump administration, focus on human rights violations, and for God's sake, leave the nuclear deal be. That's working. Whatever you do, just let that be. I hope tomorrow's speech will tell us there will be no threats to the nuclear deal for now. The U.S. will look at other ways of shoring up a new momentum, international campaign to focus on some of the many of these bad things that the regime is doing to its own people and in the region. With that, let me stop. Thank you, Khalil.
Thank you, Alex, for your informative presentation. Let me just give you one statistic that might help kind of connect a couple of the points, good points and important ones that Alex made. A few weeks ago, the Iranians released their 2018 budget. And I believe that the defense component of that budget was like in $20-some billion. By the way, if you haven't noticed, 8 billion of that, 8 billion, 2/3 of the budget was basically directed to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So in case you trying to understand and connect some of the slogans in the demonstrations to both between the domestic need and the budget and foreign policy, I think it's a pretty instructive number to keep in mind. At this time, I'd like to pass the microphone to my colleague, Charles Dunne.
Okay, thank you very much, Khalil, and thanks to the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. for hosting this event. And it's a great pleasure to be on the same podium with Ken and Alex, whom I've known for a long time. Let me start as the military does in their briefing and give you the bottom line up front on how the Gulf states are reacting to what's going on in Iran. And the bottom line up front is that they generally approve of the Iran protests because they see them both as an opportunity to embarrass the Iranian government, which is always fun, and to potentially force them to turn inward and look at their own problems, sort of making trouble in the neighborhood, especially in Syria, Iraq, and most importantly in Yemen. The hope seems to be here is that if the Iranians have to deal with internal instability, they will be less able to project power in the neighborhood and, of course, to stir up trouble in the Gulf states themselves, which they are perfectly capable of doing. And in the very best case scenario, and this is a real pipe dream at this point, some governments hope that what we're looking at or have seen in Iran recently is the beginning of the end for the regime. And there has been some speculation, which I'll get to in a minute, that maybe the Gulf states should help that scenario along. At the same time, of course, the Gulf states have some reason to be worried about what they have just seen happening. If the protests, which seem to be quieting down now, erupt again, or lead to some form of instability, the Gulf states have to be worried that the regime is going to lash out at them, blame them for what's going on, as you've seen in some of the Iranian press commentary, and then lash out. And there are plenty of ways they have to do that, whether it's militarily support of terrorism or by sponsoring subversion and unrest. Now, much more important, the Gulf states have reason to believe, or at least to worry, about the potential for something like this in Iran inspiring the same kind of reaction in their own states, because after all, the same grievances that are found in Iran are found to a certain extent in the Gulf states as well. Disenchantment with political repression and police state tactics, economies that underperform in some very significant ways, corruption, lack of government accountability, and restrictions on freedom of expression and assembly. The whole Arab Spring comparison, of course, has been kicked around quite a bit in commentary on this, including, of course, by me in this presentation. But that kind of comparison, even thinking that, must make some of these Gulf states uncomfortable. So with this big picture in mind, let's discuss, first of all, reaction in the Gulf in a little more detail, as reflected in official comment, public opinion, and press coverage, after which I'm going to turn to what the Gulf states might do about it, how they might think of engaging Iran on the basis of what they have just seen, and also how Iran might, or if Iran will change its policy in the region accordingly. So first of all, let's turn to governments. Now, governments in the Gulf have been surprisingly quiet on this whole thing, and they by and large avoided official comment, probably because they don't want to be embarrassed if the protests fail or completely peter out and they don't see them again for a while. They also certainly don't want to encourage their own citizens to think more liberal thoughts. And they don't want to encourage Iran's regime to focus its ire on them. Now, in one case that I know of where a Gulf official expressed some support for the protesters, was a UAE State Minister for Foreign Affairs. He was immediately attacked, of course, in the press by the Iranians. Public opinion, however, has been somewhat more mixed, and we sort of have to look at evidence that's out there to see how people reacted. But reports from the region suggest that, again, most people generally approved of what's going on in Iran. Countries, of course, with large Shia populations, such as Lebanon, Iraq, and Bahrain, tended to side a little more with the Iranian government view of the situation. Now, recent public opinion polling suggests why. Two surveys that were conducted in the last few months by the Washington Institute for Near East Affairs and Zogby International have shown that large majorities of Arab populations strongly are negative against Iran's politics and policies in the region. Now, the Washington Institute poll, for example, revealed that 80 to 90% plus of the public in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, as well as Egypt and Jordan, objected to Iran's regional policies. And according to the Zogby poll, which was conducted last September, there's substantial support in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in addition to the other 4 Arab countries that were surveyed, for cooperation with Israel under the right circumstances to confront Iran in the region. So, unsurprisingly, though, the Washington Institute poll also showed what I just mentioned, that in countries with large Shia populations, there's a different take on this. So, for example, it showed that in Lebanon, 82% of the Shia population approved of what Iran is doing in the region, and in Bahrain, that figure was 68%. So it's safe to assume that what's going on in Iran is looked at with satisfaction by large majorities of the populations in the Arab regions, especially in the Gulf, with less so, of course, as I just mentioned, in countries with substantial Shia, either majorities, pluralities, or minorities. Now let me turn to press coverage, and it's here that the Gulf governments are able to let their true feelings on this show, although they have a certain amount of plausible deniability, even though the press is largely controlled or heavily influenced, of course, by the governments. So press coverage in the Gulf hit a few key themes, and let me just summarize them briefly. Number one, the Iranians had it coming. Their government failed its citizens and is now paying the price. 2, the Iranian people are angry at repression and they want systemic change. 3, the mullahs should just mind their own business. They should stay at home, fix their problems, and leave the rest of us alone. I mean, that's basically what we see in the press. So let me give you a few examples of this, and here I'm indebted to MEMRI, or the Middle East Media Research Institute. Let's take reaction in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi daily El Riyadh called what we just saw in Iran the freedom revolution. And they said what is happening in Iran is a natural outcome of the lean years of oppression, repression, a deteriorating economic situation, gross interference in the affairs of other countries, and the billions of dollars that they've spent on support for terror organizations. A columnist for the Saudi daily Okaz went so far as to suggest that the U.S. should help the Iranian protesters by bombing Iranian military institutions and airports. Now, from the UAE, we have a December 31st editorial that kind of gives you the flavor. It appeared in El Khalij, and it stated, "This is indeed a genuine crisis. The people can't take anymore. The current policy has failed, as have the rulers. The cauldron is boiling. How long can the regime control the height of the flames?" And just 2 more reactions, one from Bahrain and from Kuwait. A columnist in the daily Akhbar al-Khalij in Bahrain said, "The Iranian people have gotten nothing from their rule but poverty, destruction, and ruin. Rouhani is no reformist and has no connection to reformism. During his term, the situation in all areas become worse than ever. With this intifada, the Iranian people seek to take back their free will." And a columnist in the Kuwait daily Al Watan called on the Gulf countries to act. The Gulf countries, it said, must support the intifada of the Iranian people and act in kind towards this regime that interferes in the internal affairs of the Gulf countries. Therefore, these countries must give the Iranians a double dose of their own medicine. So, just on one final note on this, in Qatar, by contrast, press reaction is very muted, as you might expect, given the government's close relationship with the Iranians. Qatari dailies basically refrained from publishing prominent reports on the issue. When they did publish reports on this, it refrained from sharp criticism of the Iranian government. But in general, I think we can say, looking at the views of the public and the press, you could say the Gulf governments would be on fairly safe political ground if they were to take more active steps to exploit Iranian unrest. The fact that they haven't done so yet, I think, reflects some of the concerns that I mentioned up front. First, worry of creating a dangerous reaction by Iran, and second of all, by giving their own ideas, own citizens ideas on how they should react to some of these same issues that are occurring in their own countries. However, I think the Gulf countries do sense weakness on the part of Iran, as some of this press commentary clearly suggests, and they will be looking for ways to exploit it. Now, what form might this take? Well, according to reports, some of the Gulf countries have, over the last several years at least, dabbled in contacts with Iranian opposition groups, such as the Mujahideen al-Khalq, which is fairly marginal in Iran, although they can and have taken responsibility for certain terrorist acts that have taken place in the country. They might also increase their ties to restive ethnic minorities, such as the Arabs in Khuzestan and the Baluch. I think personally, and I think Alex hinted at this, this is essentially a dead end and will create more problems for them than it's worth, but it will probably be under exploration. Now, most likely what the countries of the Gulf will do, and especially the Saudis, is try to increase their cooperation with the United States to check Iran. And here they're just walking through an open door, essentially. They'll certainly encourage Washington to intensify its own anti-Iran rhetoric and activities up to and including military action. From a Gulf perspective, it's much better to have Washington in the lead on this and taking big risks than it is to have Riyadh and Abu Dhabi doing the same thing, although they have been fairly out front in their opposition to Iran. Now, as far as dealing with any Arab Spring-like repercussions in the countries of the Gulf, the concern is real, but Arab governments have learned a thing or two since 2011. Governments in the region have become much more adept at repression, especially online, where much of the uprising's organization took place. Broad expansions of legal definitions of terrorism now include what we consider normal freedom of expression and opposition to rulers. Corruption charges are now being used to prosecute basically political crimes. In some cases, strategic reforms have been implemented, as in Saudi Arabia, which addresses some of the concerns of the people but leaves their ruling structure intact. Now, Gulf rulers have one other thing going for them, and that is the basic antipathy that the Arab citizens feel towards Iran means that they're not going to be looking toward Iran as a thought leader in politics, governance, revolution, or anything else. Gulf leaders are going to play on this by continuing to point to Iranian arrest as a sign of continuing instability and weakness in Iran's own system, while trying to stoke fears or worry that you don't want the same thing to happen here, because we saw what happened in the Arab Spring. It was bad. We want stability here. And this will be used in an attempt to encourage civil obedience, the opposite of civil disobedience, and justify restrictions on political activity. Very briefly, since I'm running out of time, what will this mean for Iran's approach to the Gulf states? Well, first of all, I don't think it's going to really change Iran's current engagement with the region. The Islamic Republic has too much at stake and too much leverage, in particular, at stake, to give up the support that they provide to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to Assad in Syria, and of course to the Houthis in Yemen. They have revolutionary credibility at stake, and they also use these movements and these activities to push back against both the Gulf and against the United States and its interests and influence. Let me just summarize what the regime might do. They have lots of opportunities to make mischief. This includes helping to stir up restiveness among Shia populations in the Gulf, consolidating their position in Iraq, where Saudi Arabia has recently tried to increase its own influence by building ties with politicians, continuing its activities and perhaps intensifying them as Yemen, which can also be used as a platform for destabilizing activities. And certainly ensuring that the Assad regime remains in place and that Hezbollah and Iranian forces stay for the long term to push against the United States and support Assad is another key thing that they might do. So my bottom line here is that while the unrest in Iran has stirred up a bit of excitement in the Gulf, both some hope and some worry, for the moment, it seems to be just another phase in the long-running struggle between these two political poles in the Gulf. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Excellent points. Before we cede the microphone to Ken, I'd just like to remind you that on a related subject, Ken is the author of a book on Iran called The Warriors of Islam, Iran's Revolutionary Guard, in case you're interested in that. Ken, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Khalil. Thank you for inviting me. And if anybody has any questions after, they contact me through the Arab Center. I would love to provide my Twitter address, but I only tweet about reality television, so I don't think it would help you that much. I'm going to address my comments mainly to the overarching implications for United States policy. The unrest in Iran has basically destroyed the notion that Iran is a regional superpower that can continue its high level of involvement on several regional fronts simultaneously. To this extent, the unrest in some ways undercuts the view of the Trump administration that Iran is a major threat to U.S. national security that needs to be pushed back at all costs. If Iran is imploding on its own, then it hardly poses a major threat to the United States. The unrest in Iran, I think, clearly contradicts some press analysis recently that the support for the hardliners was increasing because Iran was seen as successful in the region. I think that theory, which was advanced several weeks ago, has been shot full of holes right now. Just the opposite. Iran's regional interventions were one of the main drivers of the unrest. One of the images that struck me in the recent unrest was demonstrators tearing down the posters with the face of the head of the Quds Force, Major General Qasem Soleimani, who was just a few weeks ago hailed in some American press articles as this huge hero who was revered and untouchable in Iran and potential shoo-in candidate for president at some point. I mean, the prognosis for his future was extremely bright, and yet now we see the demonstrators tearing his poster down. So I think his political stock has diminished significantly. He was, and it still is, to some extent, a major nemesis of the United States, going back to the time when the Quds Force was attacking U.S. soldiers in Iraq. So I think many in the Trump administration are all too happy to see General Soleimani knock down a few pegs in terms of his political stature. Poorer Iranians are outraged that their subsidies are being cut back. Meanwhile, Iranian money is going to feed Afghan Shias that Iran has recruited to be part of this Fatimiyun brigade in Syria that is fighting to keep Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria. Keeping Assad in power in Syria is of ideological and political interest to the hardliners in Iran, but provides no tangible benefits whatsoever to the average Iranian. Beyond that, the hypocrisy of the regime has been exposed dramatically insofar as the regime has defended Assad, even though he has used chemical weapons against his own people. The regime has long gone to international conferences and claiming they are the main victim of chemical weapons at the hands of Saddam in the Iran-Iraq War, and how the international community ignored Saddam's use of chemical weapons against the Iranians. Meanwhile, they are backing Assad, who has used chemical weapons inside Syria. So there's quite a bit of hypocrisy that's been exposed there. The demonstrators have dealt the regime a clear setback in its campaign against Saudi Arabia and its allies. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is widely accused of reckless interventions, with certainly some justification, in Yemen, Lebanon, the intra-GCC crisis to isolate Qatar. However, President Trump has placed some significant weight on Crown Prince as a U.S. ally, a spearhead for U.S. policy in the region. However, the Crown Prince is now able to say that his intervention and his interventions have not caused domestic problems in Saudi Arabia, whereas Iran has been now suffered domestic setback. So to some, the Crown Prince now looks like, in some ways, a strategic genius who's been forcing Iran to overreach and to the extent that Iran's own regime survival has been jeopardized. This outcome, to some extent, helps President Trump diffuse criticism of his interest in Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as a centerpiece in the region for U.S. policy. And that could have potentially worrisome implications in that Mohammed bin Salman might be emboldened to take further risky actions in the belief that his strategy against Iran is working. It is not difficult to imagine that, having failed to isolate Hezbollah by forcing Hariri's resignation, the Saudis could try to activate Sunni factions in Lebanon to more actively challenge Hezbollah. Likely such things would be unsuccessful, but weak prospects for success do not seem to have constrained Mohammed bin Salman to any great extent. To the extent that the Trump administration has backed Mohammed bin Salman, his undertaking further risky action could potentially drag the United States into some unwanted conflict in the region. Now, we have, let me just get to the issue of the unrest and the administration's decision on the nuclear deal, which is due tomorrow. The first of the major sanctions laws that for which waivers need to be renewed expires tomorrow. There are 4 major sanctions laws that need to continue to be waived to implement the nuclear deal and for the U.S. to stay in the deal. These are the Iran Sanctions Act, the Iran Freedom and Counterproliferation Act, the Iran Threat Reduction Act, and the fiscal year 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. All 4 waivers need to be renewed for the U.S. to stay in the deal. If for President Trump to allow any one of them to go back into effect would likely cause the collapse of the nuclear deal. There are press reports last night and today suggesting that President Trump will be renewing the waivers and keeping the United States in the nuclear deal, at least for now. However, no decision has been announced. It probably will be announced tomorrow. There seems to be a debate within the administration. The president sees, perhaps, that Iran is now vulnerable. The regime is vulnerable, and that if he reimposes sanctions on Iran, it could weaken the regime further and lead it to fall. He might not want to justify supplying the regime with continued financial resources to crack down on the population. However, it's quite clear that his senior advisors, cabinet officers, foreign policy cabinet officers, advisors, are arguing that the protests would actually suffer if the United States were to pull out of the nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions. Doing so would play into the regime's hands by arguing that the unrest is sponsored by the United States. The United States is meddling once again in Iran's affairs, and clearly I think these advisors are arguing that to pull out of the nuclear deal now would be a mistake and would actually backfire on the protesters. So for that reason, I anticipate that there will be an announcement tomorrow that the United States will be remaining in the nuclear deal by keeping the waivers of the sanctions going. At the same time, there's nothing to preclude the administration from imposing new sanctions unrelated to the nuclear deal on human rights abusers, on international firms that are helping the regime block social media by providing internet-related networking equipment and whatnot. There is no commitment by the United States in the nuclear deal to refrain from imposing additional sanctions on such activities. Strategically, the United States can clearly benefit from the unrest in Iran. There are advantages to be had here. A weakened and chastened Iran presumably could pave the way for long-stalled initiatives and negotiations to bear fruit. First and foremost, obviously, Syria comes to mind. Iran is weakened, let's say, and it could be perhaps now persuaded to accept a settlement in Syria that the United States is pushing Mr. Putin to, that the United States is pushing Mr. Putin to organize. It's very possible that if Iran is severely weakened, they could potentially accept a settlement there that they've been blocking. So there are opportunities to perhaps work with Russia on a settlement that maybe was eluding everybody till now. There could be an opportunity to reduce Israeli nervousness by obtaining a deal that keeps Iranian and pro-Iranian militias away from the Golan Heights border, which Israel seems increasingly nervous about. And there's possible that a political solution in Yemen might now be easier if the Houthis in Yemen feel that their patrons in Tehran are weakened. So I think what we have to conclude basically is that all of these factions and governments that Iran is supporting are nervous. They see that their patron's been weakened, it's facing domestic unrest, and they're worried that Iran is going to retrench and perhaps not shower the largesse, the financial resources that Iran was. And so I think a lot of Nasrallah, I think, is clearly worried. And I think these other factions are worried that their patron might be in some trouble. So I think that creates possible strategic advantages for the Trump administration. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. And now we'll go ahead and spend the balance of our time with your questions or comments. Again, please use the cards that are on your seats or next to you to write your question. I list your name, your affiliation, and please write legibly so I could read your question. Let me start while we're gathering these questions. Ask the panel to comment on the possibility of a kind of reverse impact of what happened or what is happening in Iran on neighboring Arab societies. Alex, you referred to the youth in terms of their percentage, which is probably equal percentage in Arab Gulf states in terms of a majority of the population is under the age of 25, and they haven't been involved in politics before. That's another similarity. Will they somehow be impacted, if you will, or somehow nudged to use similar tactics? When you see, for example, right now on social media, the popularity of this new slogan, "My salary is not enough," in Saudi Arabia by young people who are saying that all this reform that MBS and is talking about and others, my salary is not enough to survive. Could that lead to kind of similar reaction on the part of youth in neighboring Arab countries? Is there a lesson there for Arab youth from Iran?
I don't want to claim to know what's going on in Saudi Arabia, but I just make a general point across the region. I think there is a clear, from my understanding, a clear detachment between the elite ruling over the ruled, if you will. And I think, obviously that's true in Iran as we've just witnessed it, and I think it's true in many other places in the region. The challenge across the board is how do you bridge that gap to the extent that's possible? How do you move closer to the people? In the case of Iran, I mean, it's just not the foreign policy part that stands out as something that the regime does for its own sake, for its own part of its own vision, which does not necessarily reflect what ordinary Iranians want to see their regime do. Let me remind everyone, one of the reasons why there was so much anger in recent weeks in Iran was because this latest fiscal budget for next coming Iranian year was introduced in December. And the horrified reaction by the public when they found out the billions and the billions that are going to these religious institutions that do nothing in terms of creating jobs and so forth, but I mean, they do create jobs in the sense that they oftentimes produce new clerics. Iranian clerics and non-Iranian clerics, and maybe that's a good thing, I don't know, but that's just not going to cut it for a majority young nation that really has, a whole different economic agenda. So I think, in terms of lessons, Khalil, your question obviously poses its own unique, raises those challenges, and they're totally valid. But there are also equally different types of lessons that neighboring states could take. Let me give you an example. One of the lessons the Iranian regime learned from the Syrian regime in 2011 with Dara is you don't go in heavy, right? Revolutionary Guards deployed only to 3 provinces out of 31 Iranian provinces, Hamadan, Lorestan, and Isfahan, okay? 2 of those provinces happen to have about 65–70% unemployment rate near the Iraqi border. But the fact that Revolutionary Guards came out and said we didn't have to deploy was mostly aimed to say we weren't needed because they're also worried about their image. The last thing the Revolutionary Guards generals wanted to do, I don't know if it was Charles or Ken who mentioned Qasem Soleimani's pictures being torn apart. I think it was Ken. That is true. And that, the contrast to Qasem Soleimani, the guy who was being sort of mentioned as a potential presidential candidate, what a distance within a few weeks. What a fall. In other words, within the Islamic Republic, there are factions that are looking at how do they not take the brunt of the blame for what is happening. And mentioning Syria, let me say something else about Revolutionary Guards, which might be a lesson for neighboring states. Revolutionary Guards was created in March of 1979 exactly for this sort of thing, to crack down. And they have had a number of tests over the years, over the last 40 years. They are practiced in this. What they didn't expect this time around, because they are so heavily concentrated on Tehran, because, all of us have heard the cliche, North Tehran doesn't represent Iran, right? The fact that North Iranis are just liberal elite class, they're small in number, they can be as loud as they want, they're easily contained. And that's what Revolutionary Guards has always focused on. Tehran, certainly North Tehran. This time around, they're hit elsewhere, from Chabahar in the southeast, all the way up to Maku and Ardabil. How do you maintain control when the economic situation make it such that the political opposition is no longer limited to a sort of intelligentsia, as they used to call it, from North Iran? It's across the nation. That is one of the lessons the Iranian regime will be struggling with to figure out what to do, whether it's possible. I mean, that's a fair question. Is it at all possible for a force of about 150,000 people to basically keep the lid on a country of 80 million, many of whom were upset? I wonder if that's a lesson that neighboring states will also learn, because we've been learning the last few years about how wonderful, invisible the Revolutionary Guards is. They can't do anything wrong. Well, that's not how they look at themselves right now. They were certainly caught by surprise.
Any comments from the other panelists?
Yeah, I would just add to this too. A couple of things. Yeah, first, I think any regime has to worry about the reaction of the military, and one of the reasons that the Shah fell was that the military decided to more or less stand by, that it wasn't going to commit the mass murder necessary to keep him in power. And I would imagine that the Islamic Republic has to think the same thing. There's a certain level of violence that's acceptable, but at a certain point it's completely unsustainable, and they don't want to be responsible for the tens of thousands of deaths that would ensue. So that's what that threshold is. Nobody seems to know. Just in terms of, of reverse effects On the Arab populations, as I said, I think that Iran is not going to be much of an example or something to emulate, source of emulation, right? To look up to and be inspired by. But some of the things that people saw, I think, are inspiring, at least in terms of tactics. Again, the emphasis on social media for getting out the message, for organizing some protests, for the emphasis on, in some cases, demonstrating quickly and then running away before the security forces get there. That is a standard tactic of effective opposition movements, and the importance of mobilizing across populations, especially in populations that haven't been particularly revolutionary before, is another thing that future organizers in the Arab world will look to, as well as the examples of what actually happened successfully in the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings. So I don't think there's a great deal of political inspiration there, but maybe some tactical inspiration. If some of these states, particularly in the Gulf, ever get to the point where you see broader demonstrations and not just tweets on how disaffected people are.
I would just add that I think, looking at the regime reaction to the protests, it seemed that they made a decision not to react the way they did in 2009. They seemed to demonstrate a lot more restraint this time. And I think that was a deliberate decision which was extremely effective in this context. They let the protests play out. Rouhani acknowledged that there were legitimate grievances. Even the supreme leader acknowledged yesterday that the protesters had some legitimate grievances. And I think the way the regime played it, I think, was very successful in causing these protests to diminish gradually. And I think they're going to look at this as a lesson learned and a best practice to apply when inevitably unrest emerges again.
The next question is addressed to Charles from Yuri Sigov. There are basically no foreign correspondents in Iran, and other panelists, you might want to also comment on this one. Do we trust any of the information coming out from Iran, considering potential manipulation by the Revolutionary Guard? Is this information that we're getting out, or that is getting out and reaching us, is that credible?
Well, I think there are foreign correspondents in Iran. I mean, New York Times' Thomas Erdbrink, who speaks fluent Farsi, has been there for a number of years and has done some excellent reporting, and there are people who are able to come in and out and make file reports on what's going on. But Iran, in some weird sense, is kind of an open society, because people can have contacts in Iran. They can call them even if they can't go into the country itself, and they can develop interesting sources that way. So I think a lot of the information, more information comes out of Iran, I would say, certainly than comes out of North Korea or something that's a genuinely totalitarian state. So I think we have a reasonably good picture of the major news events, but not necessarily, and certainly not, in fact, the inner machinations of the institutions of government and the various politicians. So I'm sure that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards do try to manipulate information, and as with any other fake news, you have to kind of judge your sources. Does it make sense stacked up against other information that you know to be true, and so on? You have to do an evaluation job as you would in any other case. I wonder if I could comment briefly on this idea of sanctions and whether we should impose sanctions, whether they'll work, whether they won't work. That's a very valid debate, but what should be debated too, I think, is what other things will work with Iran that are kind of like fingers on a blackboard to the current administration and its approach to the Iranian government, but I think are very well worth exploring. And these are the kind of people-to-people exchanges, information exchanges, and so on, that the Obama administration did some of. Bill Burns at the Carnegie Endowment, Jake Sullivan, former policy planning director for Hillary Clinton, had a great editorial in, I think, the New York Times, possibly the Post, the other day that discussed some of these things and pointed out that a travel ban against Iranians misses an opportunity to get Iranians into the country and have exchanges, and if you wanted to be a cynical, intelligence type, develop contacts within Iran, which could be useful later on. But these people-to-people exchanges are very valuable. Supporting civil society in Iran, and there are organizations that can be supported. It usually has to be done very, very secretively. But as I know from my Freedom House experience when I was director of Middle East there are people who are willing to work with outside organizations to, for example, highlight the plight of political prisoners and so on. This should not be ignored. And these are the kinds of things that the administration could do in a positive way to also affect change in Iran, if that's what it wants to do.
Thanks, Charles. Alex, on media question?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I mean, you have to appreciate someone like Thomas from the New York Times. I mean, he needs to engage in self-censorship if he wants to keep that permit alive and stay. So I can't blame the man, because I know he gets a lot of criticism for some of the sort of headlines that comes out, and people say, well, that's a bit too rosy. But he does need to engage in self-censorship, and that's basically what a lot of Iranian journalists do, if not majority of them. And that takes me to my point. If you were doing what I do as an Iran watcher, I would go through 20, 30 newspapers every morning. And I can tell you there's a wealth of Iranian debate in Iranian media that comes out, and that's very hopeful. And one of the things we can actually learn from the fact that there is this dynamic media scene. A lot of the media in Iran are controlled by the IRGC. A lot of them are actually controlled by Fars News, Tasnim. These are all controlled by the IRGC. So they put out a certain message. But there's plenty of non-IRGC media outlets. And you just paying attention to what they're saying can create a lot of, I think, ideas on this side among US policymakers. And final point, Khalil, BBC Persian does a wonderful job in doing a sort of a professional attempt of doing investigative journalism, which is sorely missing if you're sitting in Iran. That kind of stuff comes in and is very helpful. VOA has programs, VOA Persian Service have programs that do that, but VOA, in my view, can do a lot more. Radio Farda is wonderful, Radio Free Europe, but they can do more. So one of the things for the Trump administration is, please, when you consider the public diplomacy, remember that we already have instruments at American disposal that should not be forgotten. And not only that, should actually be aided, elevated in the role that they can play to directly target the Iranian people and make America's point clearly to them.
The next question is addressed to Ken from Alawi Masoud, University of Maryland. With regards to the current developments in Syria and Iran's role there, Assad seems to be shifting gears now, promising reconstruction and already working on contracts for reconstruction. Would a direct government victory lead to more economic or increase in economic activities by Iran, and would that legitimize, if you will, the Iranian regime in the eyes of its people?
Well, Iran has been an investor. They actually last year they subscribed to make some major investments, I think, in certain sectors, telecom and energy and others. I'm not a Syria expert. I don't know that Syria necessarily sees Iran as or Assad sees Iran as the key to economic reconstruction. I mean, Iran obviously has its own budgetary difficulties. They're not flush with a lot of investment money to pour into Syria. I think, I think Syria is looking to other players for reconstruction help. I would say Europe, possibly Asia, China, other players. I think the idea that the U.S. is going to somehow help Syria rebuild, I would not expect that. Do not expect that. And I don't think Assad is expecting that either. But you're certain, particularly maybe China, maybe others, potential European investors, I think that's what Assad may be looking for in terms of reconstruction help, yes.
Alex, Imad Harb at Arab Center asks, basically, could you comment a bit more on something you alluded to in your presentation, succession to Khamenei, and could you give us an idea of basically the qualifications and who's standing in line?
Well, let me just quickly tell you, obviously, if I knew the answer to that one, I think I'd be trying to commercialize on that. But I mean, nobody knows. And there's a good reason, simple reason for that. Ayatollah Khamenei would not want anybody to kind of second guess what he wants. As soon as we have any idea of who wants to be the next, or who Khamenei has handpicked to succeed him, then he's pretty much made himself somewhat redundant as a 79-year-old. But let's look at the differences between today. If Khamenei should pass on this year, what would be different from some, 29, 30 years ago, in summer of 1989? Summer of 1989, they didn't have a system in place. They made it up. Literally behind closed doors, they made it up. Ayatollah Rafsanjani is the one individual who passed away a year ago exactly. He was the one who single-handedly elevated Khamenei to the role of the supreme leader. Long story, but they changed a lot. You no longer needed to be marja. You didn't need to have the top religious qualifications. They changed the constitution. In other words, they did everything to make it easy for him to become the supreme leader. This time around, Khamenei has had about 30 years to think about it. To plan for it, and it's going to be meticulously implemented, I'm sure, if he has his way. The question is who will throw obstacles in the path of the succession, because I'm pretty sure Khamenei knows what he wants, because Khamenei knows he got the supreme leadership back in 1989 on a silver platter. He didn't have to work for it. He got it, right? He got it. Now, he needs to make sure he doesn't ruin it. I mean, that in many ways is his legacy. The ability to be able to peacefully, successfully pass the baton to the next individual. If he cannot do that, he'll be the guy who brought the Islamic Republic down. That will be his legacy, the guy who got a free ticket and ruined it. So there are names I can mention. Ayatollah Sadiq al-Larijani, who's the head of the judiciary, he's involved in corruption, he's an unlikely candidate. There's a guy who's being treated for medical reasons in Hanover, Germany right now. His name is Ayatollah Shahrudi, born in Iraq. He's wanted by some members of the German parliament for a violation of human rights. There is the son, obviously, of Khamenei, Mojtaba Khamenei, which I think is a long shot. That's not going to happen. You're not going to have father-son succession. So I can point to a couple of names that most of you probably haven't heard of, but there are names that one can point to. But I think Khamenei wouldn't want anybody to know what he's got lined up for us.
All right. To conclude, we have still just one comment and one question. I give you 1 minute each, yes or no to one, and maybe if you want to make a comment on the other one. I know you guys alluded to the fact, this is from Hamad Awais, Iran's aim is to destabilize the regimes in the region, and even if they agree to peace in Syria or Yemen, most probably they will continue to use their proxies to keep fires on in the region. Yes or no? And then with regards to the last question, I know all of three of you have had also some work, some dealings with the Iraqi situation. Any reflections on the upcoming elections in Iraq, and would that be influenced by what's happening?
We have to start with Ken.
Ken.
What was the question here? Yeah, well, I mean,
elections.
No, Iran is going to keep trying to, I mean, look, I mean, Iran has been presented with opportunities. Iran several years ago didn't say, I'm going to intervene in Yemen and Syria because that's my strategy. I mean, conflicts broke out in these places, and Iran has proxies and influence and equities, and they saw opportunities and they got involved. So, I mean, I think we have to look at the whole picture as far as, I mean, Iran is going to continue to do that. It's going to continue to exercise leverage. It's going to continue to try to arm and support proxies and allies. What I think I was saying was, because of this unrest, I think the regime has to tread carefully. I think they can't be as effusive and advertising martyrs who've fallen in Syria as much, and Soleimani. I mean, I think they're going to have to sort of mute that a little bit now, and seeing how that fed into the protests. Now, the second part of the question was Iraq elections. I don't know that I'm following that closely, but I think obviously Mr. Trump would like Mr. Abadi to emerge successful again. I don't think that's a secret. There are some pro-Iranian sharks in the water that are challenging him, and Mr. Maliki is still out there, and I think we're working with Abadi and with various parties to try to keep these sharks in a shark tank, let's put it that way.
Okay, so let's see. The answer to the first question is yes. And moving on to elections in Iraq, yes. Elections in Iraq, I think, are very interesting because there are some indications that Iraqi nationalism as an issue, or as an organizing principle, shall we say, is beginning to come more towards the fore in these elections, as we kind of saw in 2010, when you saw a lot of cross-sectarian coalitions being built to contest the elections. And that, to a certain extent, is happening. Haider Abadi is popular not in Iraq, primarily because he's really tried to tackle the issue of corruption. Of course, he was successful after an initial disaster or two in kind of helping to organize the driving out of ISIL, along with a lot of other help out of the country. Among that other help, of course, was the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, many of which were pro-Iranian militias, organized, financed, trained by Iran. Many of whom are now talking about participating as political parties or fielding candidates in the elections. I think Iran is definitely going to push this as a way to advance their own interests. But a lot of the Popular Mobilization Forces were created separately in response to Grand Ayatollah, I should say, Sistani's call for popular organizations to push against ISIL. Some of these are going to run as candidates in the election, and what I think is that they may stand a better chance this year of succeeding because they're seen as not strictly tied to Iran. Even Muqtada Sadr, who spent a lot of time in Iran, is an anti-American firebrand, is being courted by the Saudis, in part because he's taking a much more nationalist tack in his political career right now, and can be a real deal maker in the upcoming elections. So the bottom line is, I think we're seeing this play out as we see in every Iraqi election, which is forces contending on a sectarian basis versus a nationalist basis, Iran trying to push candidates in its favor, and also, as we've seen in previous elections, Iran is not always completely successful. When it does so, it has had some notable failures in its ability to bend the Iraqi government to its will. So I think this election is going to be very interesting in its outcomes. Iran will certainly try to push its agenda, but we'll see how far they can get.
Alex?
I'll be very quick, Khalil. I know time is up, but let me just, on Iraq, Charles put it so nicely, I won't get into it, but I just say one thing. What a contrast between Ayatollah Sistani and Ayatollah Khamenei right now in Iran. And maybe there's a lesson here. Once you get into politics too deep, you'll pay the consequences. And I think you see the contrast between the two. One is a genuine Grand Ayatollah. The other one has a following that claims he's a Grand Ayatollah. Everyone knows he never had the time to study in the Hosa. So, but on the point, on the first one, I'm sorry if I can't do a yes and no, but just add to what Ken said. It's about the opportunities the Iranian Iranian regime is confronted with. Since 1979, Iran has not created a single foreign policy success by going into a peaceful neighboring country and creating something out of nothing. They've gone in always when there's been mayhem, starting with Hezbollah in Lebanon. When you give them opportunities, they'll come in. It's true for Yemen, it's true for Iraq, it's true for all of them. And obviously, the Iranians are not just sitting here confronted with a united Arab world. The Arab world is divided, is deeply divided. There are Arab countries that court Iranian support. We're going to have the Jordanians visit Tehran this week. I mean, that just goes to show you. So you need to start thinking about, your priorities. And remember, the Iranian model is failing at home. So it's not that attractive. Shouldn't be that hard to push back against it and urge the Iranians to focus on their economy and come back to the Arab world as tourists and not as foot soldiers of Qasem Soleimani. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to conclude with a comment from Ambassador Masoud Malouf. He wrote me saying, 3 very informative presentations. Thank you, Arab Center for Washington. Thank you all for being here and making this possible. Thanks, Masoud. And please join me in thanking our great panelists today.